Well, hello and welcome to section 3.4 of Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria, a Catholic Response. This is a commentary that goes along with the book. Section 3.4, we're dealing with signs of mercy. I almost called it living stones. That was another term. But I'm looking at, within this section, people who are doing ministry with transgender communities in different countries. So if anybody's thinking, well, what is the church doing, right? Maybe the church is just criticizing, maybe the church is saying nothing. What is the church doing? Well, the church is the people, and there are people doing things. So this is obviously not a comprehensive list, but there are some notable cases worth mentioning, and some that are less noticeable in the press, but I think still indicative of the types of ministry that goes on. So first, when we think about, what do we think about when it comes to, in the church, gender, transgender, this idea that how are you supposed to live within the church, right? Maybe that's the question. Well, I think that when we consider, people saying, well, I don't really fit the mold, I think sometimes that part gets overstressed within the transgender issue of people saying, well, I never quite fit in. I never quite felt like the other girls, right? Or I never quite felt like the other boys. Right? We kind of take that as that is an indicator. It's built right into the DSM-5's definitions, some type of incongruity with the social and cultural expectations of you, right? That's part of the definition. It's this incongruence. But this incongruence is not necessarily anything new. In the church, we have had many examples of incongruent people, especially women who have not fit the stereotype of women at that time. So Teresa of Avila, for example, is not indicative of women in her time. She's a doctor of the church. She founded a community. She was a very strong woman. She was an intellectual. Right? She wasn't quite fitting the stereotype. Right? Elizabeth of Hungary, right? Very powerful. Catherine of Siena. Claire of Assisi, Helena, right? She's telling the emperor what to do. Eleanor of Aquitaine, right? Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. We have a long history of women who have not perfectly fit in with their gender stereotypes. Doesn't mean they're transgender. No. You cannot fit your gender stereotype, be not gender non-conforming to the social or political times, but it doesn't make you transgender. It doesn't make you homosexual or anything else. It just means you don't fit in. I suspect when we're talking about young people saying, I don't fit in with the other girls, or I don't fit in, some of this might be gender nonconformity being confused as, well, that means I'm transgender. Now, I'm not saying that is all of the cases or the majority of the cases, right? We don't have any statistics on this, but we do have good indicators that there are far more teenagers coming out as transgender than there are adults who would match, right? So, as an example, if homosexuality, for example, not very popular within culture for a long time, young people might start coming out as homosexual, but then adults are coming out as homosexual as well. So, roughly the rate for teenagers should be synonymous with rates for 50-year-olds or 40-year-olds, right? Not perfectly, but there would be likely a connection, right? People don't just if you're saying it's innate, it doesn't just change, right? So if you're saying 2% of the population is transgender, but only 0.007% of people over 40 are transgender, well, then either there's a lot of people who are much older not coming out as transgender, or a lot of young people who are identifying as transgender who might not persist in it, right? Now, if you were from the activist community, you might be more likely to say there's far more older people not coming out. If you are from the traditional perspective, you would say there were a lot more younger people over claiming that identity. The truth might be more in the middle, but tend to think that I tend to think that the conservative side is more accurate than the liberal side. And why I say that? Well, with the homosexual issue, people couldn't bottle it in and hold it in, right? Married people came out as homosexual, and it just doesn't stay bottled up forever, right? I think that's fair enough. Not that it has to be acted on or whatever, but it doesn't stay hidden forever. With this transgender issue, you don't see any statistical numbers of women coming out as natal women coming out as transgender today. You just don't. There are examples, but not anywhere near the rate in which teenage girls are identifying as male, right? And of the adults that are coming out, they are more likely, they would have been kind of butch lesbians who are now coming out as transgender, but certainly nowhere near the rates of younger people, right? So it tends to, there might be a certain amount, the moral of the story, there might be a certain amount of young people who are gender non-conforming, who are confusing their non-conformity with being transgender. Again, if you're from the transgender community and watching this, I'm not saying that all young people are confusing things. I'm not saying that. But the rates might suggest that there might be a significant number of people who are gender non-conforming who might fit into that category there. But just again to clarify, there have always been gender dysphoric people, and there will always probably be gender dysphoric people. It's just the question is at what rate. That's the question. Now, another part of the church's understanding of these things, and this is taken from Pope Nicholas I. I found it quoted by David Albert Jones, who's head of the Anscombe Society. He quoted it in First Things. I think it was in First Things. But Pope Nicholas, when he's talking about the converts to Christianity, to Catholicism, you have these pagans who are coming on, and they said, well, we ordered you clothes so that you can fit in with the culture, but wear the clothes, don't wear the clothes, we don't really care. We don't really care what you're wearing. So, if men wore, kind of like a tartan, like if you think of Scotland, the tartans, if they wore more of a tartan, they didn't wear pants, who cares? We don't care if you wear a tartan, if you wear pants, right? Put on Christ. That's Pope Nicholas's point. So again, kind of summary. Within the church, there have always been gender non-conforming people who've lived lives of holiness, and that has been sometimes part of their strength, particularly of women who have taken on the roles of kind of outside of their cultural norms, but they've done it for great good, right? Teresa of Calcutta, for example, she could have just minded her own business and been a teaching nun, but she did something grand, right? Something typically what women would not have done, or men for that matter. And if you combine that with people like Pope Nicholas, well, what clothes you wear, who cares, right? This is not the end of the day. Put on Christ, right? So I think there's a certain amount of that attitude we can have towards things, right? I think, this idea of, well, I feel like a man, I feel like a woman. Who cares, right? Right? This should not be your primary identity, I guess, would be maybe the church's point, right? It's like people who might overemphasize like the homosexual aspect, right? I am gay, I'm gay, I am gay, right? It's just, we get it, right? So it's time to move on. Can we talk about something else, right? It's interesting, but it is not the most interesting thing. If that's the most interesting thing about you, then you need to find a hobby, right? You need to find something else to do. As a friend of mine would say, people don't have enough work to do, right? If this becomes so consuming of you, then you don't have enough work to do. That might be part of it. So if we're jumping into some of these kind of role models, we have people like Sister Monica from Argentina. Pope Francis has written to her a number of times telling her to keep up the good work. She's a Carmelite, O.C.D, more from a cloistered community, but she's come across transgender people and tried to reach out to them. Now, a lot of transgender people who Sister Monica has encountered are in prostitution, right? They don't have a lot of other opportunities, kind of being poor in a slum, transgender, probably not very convincingly transgender, they have probably not convincingly transitioned to the opposite sex physically or socially, therefore kind of limited with what they can do. So Sister Monica has been trying to help out, although there's only so much you can do. They come, she prays, offers community, and then they go out and prostitute, and she prays for them, hoping that they come back healthy and nobody murders them, right? So there's a unpleasant reality to this ministry, right? One of the young women said, the only thing I hope for is a clean bed to die in. That's all I hope, that I don't just get murdered in the streets. So Sister Monica has been trying to, I don't know how far along she is on this since the article, but she's been trying to build something like a nursing home or something like that, where these people, all male to female, could have employment, right? If they could have employment. So she says they're sensitive like women, but they're strong like men, which would be perfect for a nursing home, right? They can lift people and help people, but they're more compassionate than women. I know more compassionate than men. I know these are stereotypes, but there are some truths to gender, right? Some of these gender characteristics come out of our biology. So Sister Monica is trying to do that and seems to have the support of the church, particularly her community and Pope Francis. Now, moving on to India, the names become harder to pronounce, but Sister Pavithra is from another Carmelite community, a different type of Carmelite. In India, they have thousands of nuns and many schools, hundreds of schools that they run, and they're in a part of India that's 20% Catholic. And this activist, who I'll call Malika, that's her last name, is transgender, male to female, and is trying to get women out, try to get trans people out of prostitution. See, this seems to be a theme, right? Where do people who are transgender turn? Well, when society rejects them and they have few opportunities, it's usually prostitution. So they've turned to prostitution. It's trying to get them an education and get them out. So Malika visited 700 properties, not able to secure a school, land to create a school. The other challenge is not really having money. Poor people, poor prostitutes probably don't have a lot of resources to build a school, right? You're not talking rich people who can do this. So eventually she gets connected with Sister Pavithra, and Sister Pavithra decides to help. So they had a facility, having hundreds of schools and things like that they could offer to Malika, which received the support of the local church, the local pastor, and everything like that. So, and I guess it's had mixed reviews, right? So part of the challenge with this effort was that Malika is well-intentioned and an activist, right? She can speak out for the transgender community about transgender issues, which might be very qualified to do, but she's not particularly qualified with running a school, right? If anyone has run a school, you probably are aware that it actually takes some skill, right? Education, experience, right? Especially if you're opening a school for a marginalized group of people, it's unaccredited, and you're involved in all types of other activism. This isn't 100% your attention isn't giving to this. It's probably very difficult to do. So it hasn't been very successful, because to convince these transgender prostitutes to give up prostitution, to go to school at an unaccredited school, hasn't gone so well. I guess some of the challenge has also been some of the sisters trying to convince some of the prostitutes to not be transgender, which I guess now you end up with a little bit of tension between the transgender people and the sisters, but it hasn't been overly successful. But stage 2 of this is Sister Pavithra has set up a program to allow transgender young people, right? You'd have to be pretty young because you're talking about grade school, high school, to go to one of the Carmelite schools, right? So they already run hundreds of schools. They're very good at running schools. They have thousands of sisters to run these schools. So if you just, but you do have to charge, right? This is Catholic schools in India. They might be very cheap, but not everyone has even that low amount of money to afford to go. So to offering scholarships for transgender youth to go to schools that they run, right? So that has ended up probably being a better step, is letting the sisters do what they know how to do, teach. But they have a focus with trying to get transgender young people an education so that they can get out of prostitution. That's the ultimate goal. It's not trying to change anybody, but it is trying to create a better life for the people involved. And this is, I think, what Pope Francis talks about when he talks about social friendships, right? The fact that these transgender people, in a place that's only a minority Catholic, are going to a Catholic school, it doesn't hurt, right? It doesn't hurt. Could conversion happen? Well, more likely there than anywhere else. Why not? Why not? Okay, the next one is moving now to the United States. We have Sister Louisa Doran, I think that's how I pronounce her name. She first started printing things back in 2015, but she did it under an alias because, if you recall, the sisters were undergoing visitations from Rome on their orthodoxy and things like that, and she didn't want to get her community in trouble, so she was doing her ministry secretly, unlike in Argentina and India where they were encouraged to do this. United States is a bit more political when it comes to this. This could also be a lesson where when we look to the developing world, ministry just is about the people. Here, things become very political all the time, right? You can't even minister to a marginalized group of people without perhaps getting criticized with how you're doing it and, in what way. But Sister Louisa, she kind of came across this by accident, just relationships with transgender people leads to relationships with more transgender people. Before you know it, she has a ministry going on for support for transgender people coming together to talk about issues and to get some type of spirituality. And Sister Louisa, what she points out is she's been trying to keep transgender people to stay close to God and stay close to the church. Most of them are staying close to God, but staying close to the Catholic Church is quite another matter. And Sister Louisa points out things like the Congregation for Catholic Education, male and female, he created them, which was intended to open a dialogue. Is just seen as talking about transgender people without talking to transgender people. I tend to think that the press does more harm than good in this matter, right? I think that ends up being my moral of the story. Is I think the press does more harm than good. And it's liberal press and conservative press pushing their own agendas rather than letting the church be the church. And I think that happens over and over again. So Pope Francis will say something like, we need to, well, we'll get into Pope Francis in a few minutes, but he'll say something in support of a gender dysphoric person, right? There's this person, an individual with a name, right? This person with a name, David, right? David is struggling with this, and he contacts the Pope, and the Pope talks to him, and he finds this, and the Pope offers support for this person, David. Well, this is... So the Pope very clearly gives support, pastoral support for this person. So what the press does is they'll put out a story. Pope Francis does this pro-transgender thing, right? Look at how pro-transgender Pope Francis is. And then a year later, he'll be talking about the dangers of gender theory and these ideologies, gender ideologies, and separating sex from gender. And, people are annihilating the idea of sex. It's just you are whatever you feel that you are. And he addresses this issue. And then the press will come out. Pope Francis was attacking transgender people, right? Pope Francis is anti-transgender, and people are, I can't believe the Pope said this. And other people say, see, the Catholic Church hasn't changed. They're still just as transphobic as they've always been. And people have not made the distinction between offering support for transgender individuals with gender dysphoria and gender ideology, which is why this book is Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria. They are not the same thing, right? That's why I make these distinctions, because the church has made these distinctions. So I think the press is somewhat responsible for this as well. So if we look to the Congregation for Catholic Education, they were criticizing gender theory and not people with gender dysphoria. They made a very clear distinction between the two, and here, because the way it's being reported, probably more people are reading the stories about the document than reading the document, and I think that probably has done damage too. But kind of have to hope, congratulate Sister Louisa for trying to establish community and keep people close to God and the church, even though it is difficult. She's waging a war against, there's a war against the culture. And I think the more you can make the distinction between ideology and the medical condition, the better it is. Okay, Father George Almeida. Now, a lot of these were, published cases. George Almeida is not a published case. It's an example from my own experience growing up. When I was a young person and going to daily mass, I would meet Father George Almeida and the old ladies, and we'd go for breakfast after mass. And an older person started coming to mass who was very unconvincingly transgender, unconvincingly a female, very obviously a male, and dressed like a woman without a lot of feminization. And when people started talking, why is this person here? This seems very strange. Father George Almeida says, well, the person was an altar boy for me many years ago. They came out recently as transgender, was married to a woman, has a family, and is dying of, I think it was cancer, and didn't know where to turn, so he came and found me because he remembered me when he was a child, as a teenager. People say, well, this doesn't really look good on you. And Father George Almeida said, I don't care what people say. Right? This person wants to come to church, and they have a problem, and they're dying of cancer. I am not turning them away. Right? This is the perspective. And I think even from this pretty conservative, Korean War priest who loved vestments of Our Lady of Fatima and things like this, right? This is not a liberal person. He could, even the Catholic perspective has been, if somebody wants to come to Christ, we don't stop people from coming to Christ, right? We're not waving a flag. We're not having a celebration. Nobody gets a parade. You want to come be part of the church. If you want to come part of the sacramental life, I don't care what you're wearing, right? It's the lines of Pope Nicholas. What you're wearing doesn't matter to me. Put on Christ, right? That's all that matters. And I think this is probably the type of activity that goes on in many parishes around the world, right? Probably the typical perspective. Moving on to Saint Pope John Paul II, this is another one where this issue was not as prevalent during the lifetime of Pope John Paul II, right? There wasn't a lot of transgender talk in the 1980s, right? It was certainly a subculture, but it hadn't made it into the mainline culture. And so Pope John Paul II didn't approach it much, but you can't talk about the transgender issue without addressing the issue of the theology of the body, right? This is a very instrumental part of the church's understanding of gender dysphoria and transgender, right? And this could have its own book probably, but the idea that within every heart is a longing for something beyond it, right? This is the original loneliness. This is the original condition, is to seek partnership, right? And God creates Eve from the rib of Adam so that the two become one, and it fixes, through the sacrament of marriage, man is no longer alone, right? This is part of it. There's also the idea that God is the other rational being that man can unite with, so the espousal love with God. So you have the celibate path, the path of the eunuch, and you have the path of marriage, for this longing. But this idea that there is this longing in the heart is an essential part of being a human being, and that the longing in the heart deals with sexuality and human brokenness and the ability and the desire for intimacy. This is just built into this is Catholicism 101, right? This is not an abnormality. This is built into the original narrative of Genesis. So this is part of it. So I think Pope John Paul II has good insights into this section. Now, pastorally, right, he wasn't in a position where there was a lot of pastoral support sought or given, right? If anything, what he dealt with during his papacy was the AIDS epidemic, and we did have priests and chaplains who were dedicated, and nuns and brothers and lay people who were dedicated to serving people with HIV, but specifically the transgender issue was not prominent during his papacy. But some of the ministries that popped out of it were things like Life Team. Life Team is a ministry that works with youth and is kind of based out of John Paul II's spirituality. It came out of World Youth Day, and which Pope John Paul II started. And some of the things they put out, I think, are pretty good. So, like, they have 6 steps for, if you're a youth and you're wondering about if you're transgender or not, or figuring that stuff out. It said, you are precious and loved and worthy of good things, right? Start with that. You are called to holiness, right? Focusing on holiness as an identity rather than sex as an identity. Just sex as an identity is kind of a ho-hum thing, right? Who cares, right? Find something more interesting. Medical advances are to heal, not hurt, and some of the statistics have come out to show that it doesn't really heal, right? The body doesn't have to define you your personality, right? This is another part that Pope Francis and others have pointed out is, we tend to think like, well, men are cowboys and I don't feel like a cowboy. Well, don't let that define you, right? Just be you. Just be you. And if you're a man, then that's how you are as a man. And if you're a woman, that's how you are as a woman. But, stop trying to find an identity in your sex. Just be yourself, right? That's the trick. The greatest good in life is not genital sexual expression, which is a strong one against the culture, where it's like, well, I have to, that's what I have to do. That's what I have to be, right? Find a better identity again, right? Find a more interesting identity. And lastly, the Catholic Church is a place for us to call home, right? No matter what you're dealing with or who you are, there's still a place for you within the church, right? Now moving on to Pope Francis. Now this issue has popped up and has become a mainline issue within the papacy of Pope Francis. So this becomes an important thing where Pope Francis has addressed it a number of times. Again, I think fairly inaccurately by the press, because as soon as he says something that sounds positive, Pope Francis is a supporter of transgender people. And as soon as he gives a challenge to gender theory, Pope Francis is against transgender people. And that's just not correct. In The Joy of Love, Pope Francis writes, the rigid approach turns to an over-accentuation of the masculine and feminine and does not help children or young people to appreciate the genuine reciprocity incarnate in the real conditions of matrimony. Right? The cowboy, Marlboro men and Barbie dolls probably wouldn't have a very happy marriage because they're so different. This idea of these rigid stereotypes are just probably not helpful to young people. Such rigidity in turn can hinder the development of individuals' ability to the point of leading them to think, for example, that it is not really masculine to cultivate art or dance, or not very feminine to exercise leadership. This, thank God, has changed, but in some places, deficient notions still condition the illegitimate freedom and hamper the authentic development of children's specific identity and potential. Right? This idea that if a boy likes to dance, well, he must be transgender. Right? He likes to cook, he must be transgender. Oh, that girl, she loves sports, she must be transgender or a lesbian, right? These stories that adults are telling, probably doing more harm than good. And I think Pope Francis is right on that, right? And some of the responses, sometimes within the Catholic Church, but more of evangelicals, is, well, we're just going to teach our kids how to be masculine and feminine. So girls are going to do knitting and things, and boys are going to go hunting and kill something. That'll teach them to be a real man, right? These hyper masculinization, hyper feminizations, this isn't the solution, right? It actually might drive a wedge deeper, right? Just be yourself, right? Just be who you are. You don't have to, I'm not in the right box. Stop worrying about boxes, right? This is not, everybody's trying to put themselves in a box nowadays, right? Especially the young. I came from the Generation X, which tried to break away from all boxes, which is probably why a lot of them did not become particularly religious, because they don't want to identify with anything. But the younger generation is looking for boxes, right? What box am I in, right? People are constantly doing these quizzes, what animal am I if, you take the test? What type of house should I live in? Take a test, right? And people finding what type of box they fit in, right? What Scooby-Doo character am I, right? You take a test online because you want somebody to tell you who you are, right? Which is, not helpful maybe. Now, Pope Francis, in these interviews, right? This isn't doctrine or dogma or anything, but just in these interviews, he says things, when people ask him about this for clarification. One of the times he said, life is life. Things have to be accepted as they come. Sin is sin. Tendencies, hormonal imbalance have and cause so many problems. We must be attentive. That is not to say that Not to say that it's all the same, but in each case, welcome, accompany, study, discern, integrate. This is what Jesus would do today, right? There are complexities in life, right? Right. Some of this is hormonal, some of this might be social. It's a result of the fall. Accompany people, welcome them, learn about this matter, which is why I write a book like this. Discern it, right? And again, why you write a book like this. Try a way to integrate, again, why you write a book like this, right? Because sometimes people just start with the welcome and accompany, and they don't get into the other matter. Other times you just get into the academics and you don't get into the pastoral. So the goal is really to do both, right? But Pope Francis, he also points out, don't. I know what the press is going to do. You're going to take this sentence and you're going to say, Pope Francis is, for sanctioning transgender people. It's like, I read the press, I read the newspapers. Don't do that. I recognize that this is a problem. It is a problem. It's a human problem, but it needs to be, treated medically, treated by grace, treated with God's mercy. I'm not giving a sanction to it. I'm just saying it exists, right? And I think that's kind of the church's stance on this, right? We're not going to be hanging transgender flags off the front of a church, but can we find a way to welcome people? Well, certainly, right? These are not mutually exclusive things, right? Another story Pope Francis gave was of a transgender person who wanted to go to confession to this old priest, and the priest was listening to this person's confession, I think probably right out on the street, and a young priest walked by and he saw this and he yelled at both the old priest and the transgender person, "Both of you are going to hell." And Pope Francis points out, in this story, the church does not have a consensus on this, right? It's a very divided issue. But you could get a sense that Pope Francis was more in line with the older priest than the younger one. Hear the person's confession, right? Somebody asks you for confession, you hear the person's confession, right? I think that's what Pope Francis would be, right? And the person goes to confession and they go to the Eucharist. You don't deny them Eucharist either, right? I think that would be his perspective, right? His feeling as if you are in the wrong body is not, it's not a sin, right? It's a feeling, right? Putting on men's clothing or women's clothing is more cultural than it is anything else, right? You deny somebody's communion. They're not trying to be a spectacle. They're not trying to disrupt. It can be done without causing a big scene. Why not, right? This is Pope Francis's perspective, and probably what most priests would do, probably. Right. It'd be different if this is a protest, people there, wearing banners and they're trying to make a scene. Well, that's entirely different. Just some person suffering who's trying to get spiritual support. Turning them away seems like a minority situation, right? You just wouldn't typically see that happen. Now, Pope Francis then can talk about things like the gender theory problem, right? He calls this gender theory ideological colonization that destroys, right? That's not a particularly nice thing to be ideologically colonization, right? How is it colonization? Well, he hasn't explained this, but if the view is naturally, right? Naturally, we are male and female. Naturally, our gender derives from our biology. To say no, our gender does not derive from its biology, and you can pick and choose, and it's simply about feelings, and it's a deconstruction of the patriarchy, yet and all that. Well, this is ideology. It's not natural, so it's colonization, and it destroys itself, right? Leads to great deal of unhappiness, suicide, and other problems, right? That's the perspective. Now, Pope Francis, he warns about the deconstruction. Pope Benedict also warned against it. John Paul II against it. society of relativity, the dictatorship of relativity, right? If someone tells young people to ignore their history, to reject their experience of their elders, to look down on the past, and to look forward to a future that he himself holds out, doesn't it become easy to draw them along so that they do not so that they only do what he tells them? He needs the young to be shallow, uprooted, and distrustful, so that they can only trust, only in his promises and according to his plan. Right? It's really talking about the devil here, right? If you say to young people, reject your biology, reject the experience, reject, the advice of your parents and your grandparents and the generations that gone before you, reject the advice of the church, the wisdom of the church, reject everyone's wisdom. It's just about you. Do what you feel is right. Be true to yourself, right? This is shallow, right? And it uproots from your history, right? Don't look at the past. Just look at the present moment. Well, it'll be easy to deceive the person moving forward if it's just do what feels right, right? This is the problem. Okay, so we are done with this section. The next one is, we're moving into scripture, I believe, right? I think that's the one. The scriptural approach to science. And then we will be done with this section.